Welcome to the Southeast CASC podcast, a show where we connect you with the science and people behind climate adaptation. And we're going to learn more about that term today. I'm your host, Michelle Jewell, Communications and Engagement Manager for the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. And I'm joined in the studio today by Maeda Brandizio. Say hello, Maeda.
Hello, Maeda.
Maeda, tell us a little bit more about yourself.
I'm the ORISE Science Communication and Program Scholar at CASC.
Thanks, Maeda. Today we have the pleasure of chatting with Dr. Adam Terando. Adam is a research ecologist with the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. He is also a geographer and climatologist and received his PhD in geography from Penn State University. His work focuses on climate change impacts on ecosystems and the complex human-environment relationships that drive these processes. Adam, thank you very much for spending the afternoon with us. So, Adam, how does a PhD in geography take you to be an ecologist with a federal center?
Well, first, thank you for having me. I memorized all state capitals. That's a key for a geography PhD. Beyond that, I grew up on a farm in Illinois, and weather and climate were intricately tied to how well you did during the year, like economically, and then also obviously emotionally, mentally. So I was always super interested in weather and climate. And also I grew up in this area that was all corn and soybean fields, and there are these tiny little patches of tall grass prairie. I was also always super interested in something that wasn't the monoculture of what we were growing. Mm-hmm. So that kind of led this dual track of interests for me, both climate and conservation ecology. I was always just kind of a nerd about geography, and I loved it. I liked that it was this discipline that combined a lot of these things. Like geography has these subdisciplines in climatology and ecology and geology or geomorphology and postmodernist feminist theory. Like it just really runs the gamut. So school I was going to did not have an undergraduate degree in meteorology. They only had a graduate degree. Then I looked at all right, well, I like geography, and I saw, they have climatology and they have all these other cool things. That kind of set me on my path. And then I ended up working for the U.S. Geological Survey through a series of twists and turns where I started working for this program called the GAP program, which GAP stands for Gap Analysis Program. And their mission was to keep common species common. Because I was in geography, I had a skill set in GIS, and they were looking for people that kind of knew something about ecology, but also did a lot of GIS stuff. And then I went back and got my PhD at Penn State, and it was with some of the top climate scientists in the world. You kind of felt like you're at the center of a lot of stuff that was going on, and I already wanted to do something in climate, and it just seemed like here's a great place to just really get in deep in it. Mm-hmm. Then I came back and worked for the GAP program again through NC State University.
That was at the co-op unit, right, that you had started?
And that was the other weird thing, is that the GAP program was being run out of this one particular co-op unit. That's another part of the U.S. Geological Survey. Co-op stands for Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit. Mm-hmm. And there's dozens of these across the country. They're usually based at a land-grant university in a state. North Carolina has a very well-known one. So that's where I got introduced both to USGS and NC State University. And for a while, I was actually working at NC State University. Then in 2008, 2009, Congress basically told the U.S. government, the administration, that you will stand up these things called climate science centers as part of that. At that point, it was called the National Climate Change and Wildlife Science Center. Short story long, I was able to work through that skill set. I was finishing my PhD, and the stars aligned where I was able to then slot into one of those positions for, at that time, the Climate Science Centers, which then ultimately became the Climate Adaptation Science Centers.
You said you worked at NC State. You've kind of worked around universities for a long time, but you work on the federal side of things. What drew you to the federal side versus the university side?
I wasn't as interested in a pure academic track. I love academia. I love university ecosystems and the research apparatus that goes along there and interacting with grad students and mentoring. All of that is wonderful, but there's consideration there. I was not on the track to having teaching be a primary part of my job. So the federal government has just full-time research scientists, and that was great. And you can do that at university. There's a lot of people that do that and do amazing work. But the drawback there is lots of times you're chasing grants in order to fund yourself.
The irony of you not necessarily wanting a teaching track is that you have to teach me every day about what you're doing in the field and the incredible research that you're doing. What would your advice be for people who really want to pursue a similar pathway that you have, from thinking about applying maybe a degree that they don't necessarily see that strong connection to a future career, all the way to hopefully seek employment one day in the federal government as well? What would your advice be?
It's easier to chart your course when you know where you want to get, and that can be really difficult, because sometimes you don't know what the options are. Like, I didn't know I could have a viable career related to conservation or ecology. Just keeping in mind in your core what you would like to do, what gives you purpose and what drives your passion, it just makes the rest of the journey a little bit easier. As an analogy, we talk about climate versus weather, and like weather is like a person walking their dog and trying to get somewhere, and they know where they're going generally, but the dog will like walk back and forth and, you know, go sniff this plant, go pee on that fire hydrant, etc. But they're still going where they need to go. And I think it's kind of similar in that you might have some wiggles here and there in your path, but if you truly are just being true to yourself about where you want to get for your purpose and your passion, I think it's easier than to make your own luck and for opportunities to arise.
Yeah. That leads me to my favorite question to ask and most horrid question to answer, which is, what does your day-to-day look like? What is a day in the office for a federal research ecologist?
I tend to put it in buckets of things that I work on, and it obviously could depend on the day, but the big buckets are keeping that research train rolling. There's just a ton of questions that we have, society has, our partners have, that we're trying to answer related to how climate change affects the things we care about. So whether that's me building models or working with graduate students, postdoctoral researchers, other colleagues on team-based projects, that's one bucket. Another bucket is writing, whether that's writing journal articles or reports. Another bucket is travel. Sometimes there's a lot of travel when we're a place-based research center. But also, as a federal employee, sometimes I travel across the country for different reasons or internationally. I've been lucky enough to be able to be like part of State Department delegations for when we were signing off on the latest IPCC Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, things like that. Those are also really cool things that come with being part of the government writ large. Then there's mentoring, advising, those sorts of things. A really cool thing about being affiliated with a group like the CASC is that we are part of this consortium. And so I have an appointment in the Applied Ecology Department and also with the Center for Geospatial Analytics here on campus. So I serve on a lot of graduate student committees. One more thing, I think it's called meetings. Yes, there's quite a bit of meetings. So that takes up usually some portion of my day.
You mentioned that your research addresses the various questions we have. What kind of questions are you answering right now, and how do you choose those questions?
The questions should be related to the mission of the CASCs generally. Understanding how climate change affects the nation's natural resources and cultural resources, and then working with the people that have either a stake in those resources or manage those resources, helping them come up with different strategies to adapt. For example, some things I've been working on are related to prescribed fire. Very important in the Southeast, we use more prescribed fire than any other region in the country. Managers are used to a certain set of conditions. If those conditions shift, then you may move out of your window of safe operating zone that you're used to. So understanding how climate change could affect the windows in which burn managers can apply that fire. If it gets too hot or too windy or too dry, then you don't have the same ability to conduct that prescribed burning safely. It's not only pointing out the problem, but then the next phase is what are potential solutions or options to address that. Do a lot of work in the Caribbean. First, we're doing the climate modeling there to understand how does that affect particularly rainfall over the island. And that has all sorts of implications across society and the environment. One place we in particular are working are with these little frogs called coqui. There's different species of coqui, which is very important culturally to people in Puerto Rico. So trying to understand what does that mean for their health and persistence over time. Those are the types of things that I work on. And then with the federal government, a lot of it's like, I kind of call it scientific assessment and consultation. There's a lot of that work as well, like working on the National Climate Assessment, or, again, I mentioned the IPCC reports.
I'm struck by, while we're talking about your career and trajectory, there's two elements that seem consistent. One is the future, and one is people, and how people are going to navigate that future. And I feel like that ties nicely into my understanding of what climate adaptation looks like. But I'm curious, how do you define climate adaptation?
I think that's a good way to put it, because you really do need to go back to who are we working with, because they're the ones that are ultimately taking the actions, particularly as USGS scientists. We are not a regulatory agency or a management agency, so we do not set rules, nor do we implement things on the ground. So it's about that really clear understanding in terms of what is their mission, what are the values that come with that mission, and what are the objectives they have, and how might those objectives change as the climate changes. So then for adaptation, I try to bring it back to that mission, values, objectives framework, thinking about how can you still thrive as the climate changes. By thriving, you can define that however you want. That can either be, you personally, or it can be the resources that you want to manage or are attempting to help do better. One distinction we typically try to make is it's more than coping. Coping is almost like a rear guard action response, like where you're just reacting to what's going on and you're hoping that you can just get back to where you were. And then if things continue on that way, it may be harder and harder to cope because more and more damages pile up. So adaptation is trying to live with the changes that are happening. And in my mind, where we come in then is also using science to do what we can to peer into the future, to give our partners the best chance to adapt in a way that won't leave them hanging, where they'll see what the fuzzy future looks like, or that range of outcomes could be, and then they can develop strategies that give them the best chance of still meeting their mission, values, and objectives.
What you're describing to me sounds like a lot of self-analysis on the end of either partners or communities to, one, realize change is happening, and then two, assess what is important and valued. Are people more ready to talk about different futures than maybe the future that they inherited 2 or 3 generations ago?
When I answer this, it may be not the way you're expecting, but I would say...
I welcome that. I love that.
Okay. Well, I would say yes, but there's only a subset of the population there was that reticence for a long time. Mm-hmm. For other partners that we work with, they've already seen how humans can change the environment in really drastic ways very quickly that has a huge impact. So maybe they heard about global warming from like James Hansen and Al Gore in 1988, and they were already primed to be thinking about how much influence humans can have on the planet in different ways.
Right.
So a lot of our partners have been there for as long as I've been in this. What's interesting is, yes, there is more, I think, introspection and reflection and consideration and accepting of evidence. Now, obviously, everyone's not on the same page. And that, I think, comes in from where we mix in values with science, which is a common thing. I feel very comfortable in that space because I like just talking about, here's information, here are some things you could do if you're interested, if you want to. But I am not here to tell you that you must do this, that, or the other thing. Yeah. That is not my job, nor do I want it to be.
Right. Yeah.
I think that it's seeping into the consciousness of society. What does it mean that the climate's changing? What does that mean for things I need to be considering or we need to be considering now that were things that we did not consider a generation ago?
Can you take us through an adaptation success story with one of the projects you've worked on?
And like, what does that success look like? Or how do you define it?
Yeah. It's really hard to answer those type of questions just by the nature of what we're doing. It's a moving target. it can be really hard to track those things down.
Yeah.
But let me give you like an example of things that I think could be good. For instance, one of our main partners is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and there's the group there that works on the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy.
We talked to Hillary. She has a podcast.
Hillary's great. Yes. A project I worked on many years ago was modeling scenarios of urbanization and suburbanization in the Southeast. And that paper was, I think, pretty useful for people that were not only thinking about what are the direct effects of that, but also the effects of that related to how do we adapt to climate change. And that was actually the reason I got involved in that study, is because I was trying to help managers understand if the climate changes and you start having movement of species, what of those corridors or pathways might be getting cut off quicker than others because the sprawl is reaching them. The conservation blueprint through CASC, they incorporated the information from that study into their blueprint. And I know that gets used a lot and it has influenced some decision making. There's like some conservation actions that you can tie back to that, which I do think result in a more resilient landscape where you can absorb some of the changes.
Yeah, and I just want to define something that Adam just said. His pretty useful paper that he mentioned was cited 266 times so far. So yeah, I would say that's pretty useful, Adam, just to brag on your behalf because I know that you won't.
Fellow Midwesterner.
And I'm so glad you brought up urbanization because that was going to be my next question for you too. Because when we think about climate adaptation and futures that we need to plan for, we think about the regular ones. We think about, and by regular I mean the popular ones, heat, sea level rise, the things that we get messages about in the news regularly. But urbanization is another climate adaptation challenge of the future. For the Southeast, what's the story with urbanization and what does that mean?
Man, there's so many axes that you can think about with it. The way we do a lot of development in the United States, it's oriented around cars. I should say SUVs. That's all anyone drives now. SUVs and trucks if you're in the Southeast. And so that means you're putting in a lot of asphalt because your built environment is oriented around temporary storage of private vehicles. So you just have huge parking lots, which really change the energy balance at the surface and can affect then the heat that is in that localized area. And so cities and suburbs have to think through that. Then there's all the knock-on effects. And again, that goes back to that original study I was doing. What's the effect on, in particular, wildlife and natural resources? So that's another effect in that you're really creating this unique, no analog ecosystem of land cover type that would not be found as an emergent property except for humans deciding we want to orient our lives around cars. Mm-hmm. And so then that does things like it fragments the landscape. So now all of a sudden you have these barriers, i.e. roads, that weren't there before. And in particular, we have these kind of fractal patterns of growth because then you get into the sociology of it where everyone wants their own little square of lawn. Mm-hmm. So that has just huge implications for wildlife, natural resources, biodiversity. Then you layer on top of that, now the climate's changing. So if you're like some random species that was native to that region, then all of a sudden you have this huge shift in your ecosystem and it can really create havoc. And that's just scratching the surface. We could do a whole other podcast on that. I think it's sort of an underappreciated, huge change. It's another natural experiment that we're all living through right now. How does the way we live in this sort of suburban landscape, how does that affect the earth?
And what does the rate of urbanization look like for the Southeast? Is it greater than other areas?
Yes, it is. In general, we call the Sun Belt. You can think of a wide swath from Arizona through Texas and then over to the Mid-Atlantic and down to Florida. That's really where most of the growth in the country is happening right now. There's disproportionately higher rates of growth in those regions. Mm-hmm.
So how do you cope emotionally and mentally working in these questions of futures and adaptation and these big questions that can be very sobering in a lot of ways?
Sure. Since you asked me how do I cope personally, now I have to take off my Fed hat and just say personally, speaking for myself and only for myself, even when things are not looking good, for me, working on the thing that doesn't look good helps me feel less helpless, right? Having purpose in your life, I think, is very important for people. if nothing else, I know that I am working on this big problem facing humanity. Now, that can be both in terms of the global accounting exercise of like, is the gigatons of carbon we're putting in the atmosphere worth it, considering all the consequences, where I do my tiny little part to inform the world about the consequences of climate change, or whether it's working with individuals, people on the ground to try to come up with strategies to adapt to what may be coming. I have a wonderful opportunity and career, and it's been awesome to be able to work on this and all the people I get to work with, including you two. So that's how it helps me. And I love it. You know, things can look dire for sure. I know at least I'm on the front lines and not in the back of the line, just letting things wash over me.
Adam Terando from the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center, thank you so much for spending your afternoon with us, talking to us about your career, about climate adaptation. We've learned a lot. We've laughed. We've loved. We've had a great time. Thank you so much, Adam.
Thank you both. Appreciate it.
The Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center podcast is organized by, you guessed it, the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center, and produced with an immense amount of help by the NC State University Libraries team. The USGS Climate Adaptation Science Center's mission is to deliver science that is useful and used to help fish, wildlife, water, land, and people adapt to a changing climate.